يأكل نبل كلنا نسلامنا يأكل نبل كلنا نحكن قوامنا يأكل نبل كلنا ونعبيتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا وهدتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا غرعتنا سقرم
My name is Emnet. We are live streaming today from Global Yaakl. I'm interviewing our famous Professor Dan Connell. He's been a participant, observer of Eritrean scene for nearly 5 decades, starting in the 1970s during the liberation struggle. He followed events in the country closely as a journalist, an analyst, and eventually as academic, writing hundreds of articles and papers about the country's successful rejection of Ethiopian rule and its adoption of bold and creative approaches to the challenges of development and national building. Having marched and sheltered under fire alongside the liberation fighters, he came to know the leaders of the country intimately. But over the years, increasingly troubled by the repressive stance of Isaias Afwerki government towards the press and political opposition, he's found himself shifting from being a long-standing supporter to a critique of Isaias Afwerki and its regime. Welcome, Dan. And you're going to give me an option to call you either Professor Dan or Dan Connell or whichever it is, but welcome.
Thank you very much, Emnet. No, I'm comfortable with Dan. That's all right. We know each other now, so
awesome.
Feel free.
Awesome, awesome. So my first question goes for you that can you start telling us about your early intimate relationship with Eritrean freedom fighters and their leadership? How much of the liberation fighters were more democratic, team-oriented, rather than what we're seeing now, just very autocratic and individualism?
Well, my engagement with Eritrea came actually after I was already in Ethiopia. I went to Ethiopia as part of a trip to Africa in 1975. I had planned to spend a year on the continent after many years of following the liberation struggles, the decolonization movement in Africa, and being involved in political movements in the US for social justice and freedom, from civil rights to the protests against the war in Vietnam, which I mention in a way just because protesting against my government has been a part of me ever since I've been a child. It's a very big part of a democratic upbringing. But I was drawn to the countries that were in the process of redefining themselves, emerging from the colonial era and choosing new paths for themselves. My initial interest had been in the struggles in Southern Africa, and particularly South Africa, where the struggle against the racist apartheid system drew me because of this, the resonance it had with the situation in the US. But I was drawn on the way to Ethiopia, partly because it was going through a profound transition of its own. Under the Derg, Haile Selassie had been overthrown by a self-declared socialist junta, which was going to transform Ethiopia into a revolutionary paradise. And it was being supported by the United States, which is an anomaly that I could not resist. As an American, I had an interest in the situation there and a responsibility too, because the US had been supporting Ethiopia from the 1940s, from the early 40s, even before we got into World War II. It was the entry point for the US in the continent. And there were bases there, of course, in Eritrea and a very big presence in Addis. So I went to Ethiopia in the fall of 1975. And it was while I was there that two things happened. One, I saw firsthand the contradictions of the Derg and the fact that the rhetoric didn't match the reality. And we'll come back to that issue later, I know. But I traveled out into the countryside in Ethiopia, in the Ogaden region in the southeast, in Wollo, and eventually into Tigray, and elsewhere. And wherever I went, I saw that the regime was not involved in transformational activity with the people. On the contrary, it was channeling resources into a war in the north of the country that no one seemed to know much about, in a place called Eritrea. There were no journalists allowed, so there was no coverage of this. It was as if it didn't exist. But the more I heard about it, the more it seemed to me to hold a key to understanding what was wrong in Ethiopia, what was wrong in the relationship between the US and Ethiopia as well, because we were pumping arms and equipment still into the country at that point. So at one point I had the experience actually of speaking with an Eritrean in Addis and on Churchill Boulevard, who had been friendly, and he offered to show my friend and me around, and thugs came up from Ethiopia's security service and beat him into the ground because he was talking to a foreigner, and they assumed that as an Eritrean, he would have been talking politics. In fact, he hadn't been. But it sent a clear message to me that there was more below the surface here that needed to get unpacked. So I asked more people about it. I heard more about it. This is when I really learned about the struggle, was in Addis, and from Eritreans who were there. So I got permission to go up into Wollo and Tigray from the Relief and Rehabilitation Commission, the RRC in Ethiopia, to go look at the feeding centers that were taking care of the people who were the victims of the previous famine in 1973-74. And that's what I had been looking at, was what is the government doing for the poorest in its countryside, as a way of understanding who it was. So I got the permit. We went up to Wollo, and from there into Tigray on our way toward Eritrea. I took the opportunity once we were out to keep going. So the two of us, my friend and I, started hitchhiking. She spoke Italian, so we started meeting Eritrean truck drivers. And we got up into Maichu, anybody who knows where that is. And there we met two Eritreans who were driving back to Asmara in two little Volkswagens that they were transporting. They'd come in through Dire Dawa and they were driving them back up to Asmara. When we explained to them what our interest was, that we wanted to know what was going on in Eritrea and what was the role the US was playing there, they invited us along, took us north to Mekelle, talked to friends there, got us a permit to go on the convoy. And then we went up north to Aksum and waited until there was a convoy. Finally, after about a week, we got a call to come to Adwa. The convoy assembled at 5:30 in the morning, and then some 500 vehicles moved from there across the border and into Eritrea. That was my first trip. We were trying to understand something about the liberation struggle. We were hoping we wouldn't be ambushed on the way. We weren't, luckily. But the second day we were in Asmara, the colonel who had led the convoy was assassinated in an attack by the EPLF. It was set up by his so-called girlfriend, who ran a bar right off of what's now Untitled Avenue. And that, of course, is the first chapter of Against All Odds, my first book.
Yes.
But that's how I got drawn into it. Now, what happened then was that I traveled around the city and asking people what was going on there. The situation deteriorated quickly by the second day after that assassination. Ethiopian troops shot up the city. We all went into a kind of state of emergency and under curfew. People had to be back in their rooms at dusk. But as I moved around in the daytime after that, people were saying to me, this is normal for us up here. This is what happens. And all the troops that I was seeing carrying these kinds of operations out were wearing US Army uniforms, surplus uniforms. It was very disturbing to me. So I resolved at that point to find out more and to come back. We got out on an airplane back to Selassie and took bus and truck to get back to Addis. I set out to write a story about this. And in the process, when I was in Addis, I had been talking to somebody in the US Embassy who was disturbed at the policy of the US. And so he leaked to me some information on an upcoming campaign, the Woda Zamach, as it was called, to try to recapture Eritrea from the rebels, because at that point, the EPLF and the ELF held most of the countryside. The government could only move about by armed convoy. So he leaked the story to me. I sent it off to the Washington Post. The Washington Post printed it on the front page of the paper, and I then launched my journalistic career. I had done some writing for small newspapers before that. I was an activist in college and university, writing for the student newspaper. I wrote for a black newspaper actually in Boston called the Bay State Banner at times. But this was really a launch for me into a new level of writing. I hopped on an airplane from there, went back to Sudan, met with the EPLF and the ELF and asked them if I could go into Eritrea to see the situation from their side. It took 5 weeks to vet me. There was somebody in the office there who managed this for the EPLF. His name was Hagos Gebre-Hewitt, Hagos Kisha. And what they did was they sent information back to their people in Washington, who then investigated me. They asked me to write a biography of myself. They checked me out. They came back and said, finally, okay. And I understood their suspicion. I mean, with the US being in the role that it was in Ethiopia. But eventually they approved. And as soon as they did, the ELF said yes. It's like, if you're going to go there, you can come here. So I made an arrangement to go 5 weeks into Eritrea, half with one front, half with the other. I traveled out to Port Sudan, where I was met by somebody else whose name will be familiar to some people. It was Naisgi Kiflu, who came to get me in a broken down Land Rover that had been captured. We drove in to Eritrea through northeastern Sudan. And then I traveled for 2.5 weeks. I had a young guy who was my guide. He didn't have any front teeth. It was kind of funny. It was a guy named Sabhat Ephraim. His teeth had been shot out in a training accident. But that was my first introduction. Nobody from the leadership identified themselves as a leader. Sabhat didn't tell me who he was. He was just a cadre who was assigned to be my guide. I was in Philphil and met a lot of the leadership at one point. Didn't know it because they didn't identify themselves. And then I got put with the ELF, traveled around Asmara with them, came back out near to Tessenai, saw both sides of the struggle. And what impressed me about each front really was that they were involved more in social, economic, and political activity than they were military. So from the outside, you see an armed liberation front fighting for independence. On the inside, you saw two political movements trying to create the basis for a new state. They were doing agricultural extension work. They were doing support work with merchants for trade. They were doing land reform projects. They were reorganizing village administration from the traditional, basically, chieftaincy to tapping into the tradition of village elders in the highlands and building village committees. It was a fascinating process, and it was that transformational approach to the struggle that it seemed to me that it gave people a stake in the struggle that was well beyond just getting the Ethiopians out and putting a flag up. It was something tangible that they would get from the struggle, and it motivated people in a way that helped to equalize the balance of force between a very tiny country in the north and a very big country supported by a superpower to the south. I left at that point determined to come back and learn. Pardon me?
Your volume went off.
Are we back on? Do you have me again?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, so in that summer when I left, I went back home. I wrote stories about it. I got it published in the Washington Post and other places, a newspaper in New York called The Guardian. And then I sat down and studied journalism, number one, so I could really be a professional journalist because I hadn't had that kind of training. And Eritrea, number two. In 1977, I went back, and then I went into Eritrea for 6 months with some breaks to go out to Sudan, but basically 6 months living inside with the fighters to see it from the inside. I was at that point given a pass that I could carry around, and I could basically go anywhere. There were bus services at that point that were running at night. So I could travel on my own anywhere in the country. It was the freest I'd ever been, and was for many, many years after that. In the middle of that, I made one side trip that is worth mentioning, and that was that in November, after I'd been there for 4 months already, I was hearing about another struggle taking place in Ethiopia, in Tigray, with a group called the TPLF. So I asked the people in EPLF, could I go travel down there to visit, to see it? They agreed. And I traveled to Sorona with a guide from the local, from Dekamhare, who had been in the political office there. It was a guy whose nickname was China, Haile Samuel. And I went into Tigray with the TPLF. We went to Debre Damo. I met a lot of people in the TPLF, saw them, came back, and was with the EPLF then until the end of January of 1978. I was also in Massawa in December during the fighting there, which was really a turning point in the war. It was the end of the EPLF advances. But by that time, I was deeply immersed in the situation. I was taken more, as I said in the beginning, by the transformational approach to the society itself than I was just the struggle for independence. It got infinitely more complicated in the end of 1977 and the early part of 1978 when the Soviet Union came in, which changed many things for many people, including here in the US. But for me, that was not the central issue. The central issue was, who are these fighters? What are they fighting for? And I kept going back, and I've been doing it ever since. But it was really those initial encounters that got me engaged.
Have you gotten a chance to intimately get to know some of the leaders and then enough read some of your commentary that you knew some of them from their leadership and personal as well. So can you talk about a little bit about that as well?
Sure. When I went back the second time, I met people by name and by position. So then people said who they were, and I started meeting with Isaias every time I went, and we would sit down together. Mostly it was interviewing and talking about the situation. I spent a lot of time with Haile Wildetensai Duro, who I got a lot of tutoring on what they were doing politically. And I got to know Wode Solomon fairly well. Petros Solomon, of course, who I met in Zager, a village where I spent a lot of time. And I met many other people, but I think those were maybe the people that I started to get to know the most. Starting in the 77, 78, really, I got closer to Yamani Gebrab, who had been in the US, who I had actually met in New York for the first time in 1976. No, 1977, in March of 1977, when he and Hagos critiqued some articles I'd written. This wasn't right, this wasn't right. It was a very controlling approach, but we had a fairly active relationship from then on. So yes,
and
short answer.
And you want to tell us a little bit about the picture behind you? I know in an earlier conversation you mentioned.
Right. Well, that's really from the 90s. So in the late 70s, things changed a lot with the Soviet intervention and the withdrawal back into the countryside. 1979, I made a big trip to Eritrea, walking behind the lines up to Asmara, seeing the situation outside of where most people were. And then in the 1980s, I started an aid organization, Grassroots International. 1990s, I was back again for right after the war was over in the fall of 1991. And then again in 92, 93. And then at that time, it was a very hopeful situation in Eritrea. There was hope that there would be a transition to a more democratic future. And the Constitution Commission was a big part of that. That poster was the promotional poster for the Constitution Commission. And I clipped the text off the bottom when I posted it up there, but there's a picture there of a tank, a T-55 Russian tank that had been captured by EPLF, sinking into the sand as the sun rises behind it. And it symbolized the end of a 30-year war and the onset of peace and the hope for prosperity and peace in the future. I keep that there to remind me that this is still in Eritrea's future.
Absolutely. So let's move to the next question, which I have been really excited to talk to you about, which is the era of like post-independence and after that romantic time of, earning our independence and the government moving to a direction of dissolving any non-government organizations such as the Regional Center for Human Rights and Development, the dissolving of village self-governing. And these are the most important things, that really is the fabric of Eritrean society, and just basically eradicating any traditional democratic practices to a single man dictatorship. So there's a lot of details, and I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but if you can kind of give us like bullet points of what happened past the independence and to now make it a single man dictatorship country.
Okay, well, I have to go back just a little bit to get there.
Sure.
first of all, during this struggle, I clearly bought into the notion that the need for secrecy, for authority, discipline, trumped everything, to coin a phrase. And it was necessary to make the liberation struggle as efficient and effective as possible. And so I bought into this with some caveats. One, I had the experience in the mid 80s with Isaias of having started this aid agency, Grassroots International, that I mentioned. And then it was a fly-by-night operation. We had started with a little bit of money after I left an organization called Oxfam America, if you know what it is.
Yep.
And I had been hired by them actually in 83 to go into Lebanon. So I was in Beirut during the Israeli invasion, and because I had had experience in a war zone, because I had been in Lebanon before, which is another story. I was hired by them to put together an emergency program. I left Oxfam a year later to start Grassroots International with an aim to be involved in Eritrea and Lebanon and Palestine and other areas of struggle where there was both need and opportunity for transformational change. So we soon got involved in South Africa after all. But in the 84, 85 period, when the famine finally came to public awareness through the big famine, the Africa famine in 83, 84 really broke into the news in October, November of 84, when the BBC broadcast pictures of starving people in Tigray. That was then rebroadcast in the US on NBC TV. And all of a sudden, everybody woke up to the fact that there was this terrible famine in Ethiopia because of drought. Well, we knew at Grassroots that it wasn't just drought, it was war. It was a man-made crisis, and it was worse in places like Sudan, Angola, and other places where there was also civil wars going on. So it was a mix, really, of natural and man-made causes. So Grassroots International started saying this. We got a lot of attention. We started raising funds for the first time. I had been actually painting houses to pay my own salary while I was doing this before that, because we didn't have any money coming in. But then we took some of the money that we raised and we invested in the Eritrean Relief Committee in the US and also in Relief Society of Tigray, REST, to build them up so that they could work within their communities and also to introduce them into the NGO community. There was a big trade association of NGOs. We got them involved in that. And we started talking with media about the situation, telling them they only had half the story. So we took an NBC camera team into Tigray at the time. We couldn't get them into Eritrea. We had a Christian Science Monitor reporter we took to Eritrea. We set up an office in Tigray, in Khartoum, to educate journalists who were pouring in from all over with no knowledge of the situation to report on a famine. And we set them up so that they would meet people from the Eritrean offices and the Tigray offices. So we were providing an avenue for more information, more advocacy, and more money that we were sending to ERA, the Eritrean Relief Association in Eritrea. What happens? I get a message from Isaiah saying, shut this organization down. We have our own organization. We don't need yours. This from a guy who I had known so well, we talked about that we could meet every time I went into Eritrea. Personal matters didn't affect his judgment then, and they never have. He's not a sentimental guy. But political judgments that involved anything other than his ability to control the situation were obviously impossible to get past. And I learned a hard lesson there, that he is more interested in control than in solidarity and in relationships. I still kept going back because I was never there just for one person. I just don't think that that's the way movements, governments, and people work. There's much more going on in Eritrea than him. I pursued my other relationships. I went back. I still interviewed him when I went. I refused to dissolve the organization. Another member of our board, an Eritrean you may know, Barakat Haile Selassie, was told he should quit the board. He refused also. Because we were doing something nobody else could do as an American intermediary on that. I tell that story to say I have not had any illusions about the leader of Eritrea since that time. But I had a very different picture of Eritrea as a whole. And I came into the 90s thinking that here is a man with autocratic tendencies, but there is so much else going on in this movement that if there can be an institutional structure, a constitution in place, a constitutionally elected government, and a popular assembly, there will be checks and balances on him personally, and Eritrea can then go forward and struggle these issues out in a different way than they had before. I was naive. And the issue that you raised about the Regional Center for Human Rights and in the early 90s being shut down was a key signal of that. There were others too. There were daycare centers that were started by ex-women fighters who were shut down because there was the women's union and that had to run everything. An independent daycare center was a threat. Anything that was not controlled by the party or the state, pretty much, was forbidden. So I started to argue about this with people like Yamani and others privately. I didn't make any public fuss about it. I still was a little wary of that. I regret that now. But I still had hope that once the Constitution was in place, things would change. I think actually the moment for change was the early 90s. And the first problem there was that after all that struggle, the EPLF wouldn't permit the ELF to come in as an organization. And the ELF represented a key constituency of the national struggle and a key constituency, a key segment of the population. So if it didn't have room at that moment for other Eritreans, what was the prospect for a future? I struggled with this throughout the 90s. When the war broke out with Ethiopia in 98, I was there supporting the struggle. I wrote about it on behalf of the Eritrean perspective. I went out to the front lines, to Sorona again, and I was in Zalambasa and other places on the front lines, 98, 99. My wife was there during that time at one point too. But I had more and more questions that were coming up about the situation. And the fact that the government was not implementing the Constitution at that stage, ostensibly because you can't do it in wartime, but it's a nonsense argument. And you can have elections in wartime. I mean, lots of countries do. You could have had it in 98 before the war started. But the manner in which the war was being waged too, and the leadership struggles that were going on behind the scenes, which I was hearing a lot about from people that I knew very closely within it, told me at that point that there was really a coup taking place within the state, for a top-down coup in a sense, purging of critics from within the movement, unbeknownst to the rest of us outside because you couldn't see it perhaps, but I was hearing about it again from the inside. And I think that by the beginning of 2000, it was pretty clear that things were going in a very bad direction. And that whatever happened with the war was really a cover for this seizure of power. At this point in the beginning of 2000, I became increasingly convinced that one way to understand this was through the role of the secret party that had run the EPLF throughout its existence, the Eritrean People's Revolutionary Party, or EPRP, which became known as the Eritrean Socialist Party toward the end, but that doesn't matter. The party, though, ran the whole organization. So when I was seeing the discipline in the 1970s of the fighters and hearing everybody almost give me the same answers to political questions, it was a little disconcerting. But the reason for it was that there was a party going on within the ranks of EPLF, organizing, politicizing, and maintaining control of all the decisions and strategies that the front then adopted in public. It was meeting in advance of the congresses of EPLF and deciding what the program would be, what the leadership would be, and then the front would meet and have a ostensibly democratic process that was already determined. So I started to investigate that party to find out more about it because I saw the same thing happening in the 90s. Was there a party? I still don't know the answer to whether there is, but it certainly behaves like one. But the party in its own way was more democratic then than the situation is today, but that's another question. But I also started then to interview people about the party, as you know, and one of the outcomes from that was a book called Conversations with Eritrean Political Prisoners. The first chapter in that was an interview with Haile Woldetensai, which I did in January, I think, or March of 2000 when he was foreign minister. And at that point, he told me, had already been telling me, there had been debates within EPLF about the conduct of the war and about the delays in implementing the Constitution. There had been struggles over this that had broken out also in a September meeting of the National Assembly and the Executive Committee of the party, the PFDJ, in which Isaias was criticized, and he basically kept quiet, but moved immediately after that to start setting in motion a purge. So by January of 2001, there were meetings going on in the ministries, and ministers were not invited. It was the mid-level cadre who were holding them. They were trashing the people at the top, and they were setting the stage for a purge of all of Isaias's critics.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that in your previous essay, you did mention two major tactics that Isaias really used to not create any concentrated power outside of him, which is basically dealing with the mid-level cadre to shaming their leaders and just kind of, you know, decentralizing any leadership. And the second part is just shuffling power across the ministerial leadership and just kind of alternating people, freezing out people, and just kind of keeping the old school method of any autocratic leadership. So touch a little bit about that, and then we'll get to the meat and potato of today, which is the US policy towards Eritrea.
Yeah, I mean, these are standard policies and strategies of any autocratic dictatorship. Haile Selassie used them in Ethiopia in the past. You see this particularly in China, and it's the Chinese experience, I think, that's had the most influence in Eritrea. Of course, Isaias was in China during the Cultural Revolution in 1968, and I think he took a lot of lessons from that experience. If you ever want to understand Eritrea's military strategy, go and read Mao's military writings. For example, the strategic retreat is a key part of that. But the notion of the vanguard party is also a crucial part of Maoist thinking, as is the strategy of renewing the party by attacking the leadership periodically and purging it at the top, and narrowing the circle of people who make decisions to those who are most loyal to the leader. Now, interestingly, we've seen something of that going on in the US over the last 4 years as well. You and I talked about that earlier. But one of the things that happens there is that the leader purges all the people who criticize and have a different view until they get people who either have the same views or keep their views to themselves. And I think it's two different possibilities here. But the result is that the leader gets no fresh input from any other source. You get surrounded by yes men, so to speak, sycophants, as we say. And the decision making itself gets worse and worse until you start making big mistakes. And I think that's where Isaias is today.
I love the term sycophants. I think that's quite a bit of a few followers of his with really not understanding his capability and the damage that he does, that they continue to support his way of leadership.
One other little thing, I mean, the trick to maintaining yourself in power there is to create an identification between the nation itself and you. And that's what Isaias has done. So when you or I are going to criticize Isaias, people say we're criticizing Eritrea.
Yeah.
No, I love Eritrea. I know you do too.
I do. I think that's a tactic of any government. I mean, we've seen it in the US as well, right? Anybody that criticized over the last year of the president, personal attacks, change of power, and things like that. So this is not unique to Isaias, but he does really, really expert level of controlling the country. So the hot topic that a lot of the viewers have been asking to have a conversation with you is that talk about US policy and how does it work, particularly when it comes to Eritrea. Many of the diaspora hope for some positive influence, if there is any, from the current administration. And if you can just kind of share some of your input, how US policy have been able to influence the region, particularly in Eritrea. Are there any outside players that we should be keeping in mind in current situation? So if you can talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, to begin with, I think you have to understand that the U.S., like any big power, is going to be guided by its own interests. That's number one. And it's never going to be anything else. Now, there can be different perceptions of that interest, and there can be different perceptions of how to pursue that interest. But U.S. national interest is going to be the first consideration. So if you're interested in influencing the U.S. relationship with Eritrea, you have to be able to make an argument that sees a coincidence of interest between what you're arguing for and what the U.S. stands to gain. It's not going to be a charity. It's not going to do something because it's morally right, even if it's Joe Biden or Barack Obama, or anybody else. And that's the way politics works. That's the way nations work. They act in their own interest. There can be various differences of opinion about what that interest is, as I said. But in the current situation, U.S. national interest in the region is served by strengthening counterterrorism activity, defending against the spread of Islamist extremism is one part of that, countering China's influence is another. I mean, in some other parts of the world, you could argue that it was economic interest, but I don't think there's a tremendous economic interest coming out of the Horn of Africa for the U.S. It's more about the negative interest of instability breeds humanitarian crises that generate demands for U.S. response and for money. resources and so on. So instability also creates openings for terrorism and for other problems to infiltrate an area. So U.S. interest is, number one, about stabilizing the situation in the Horn and using that as a base of operations for trying to extend U.S. influence in the surrounding region and to prevent the growth of extremism in the region. There are other aspects of this too, but you need to really understand what U.S. interests are. Now, then you could argue about what best serves that interest. Now, the last administration, the Trump administration, which had an ideological inclination toward autocratic regimes, identified U.S. interests directly with those of the Saudis and the Emiratis and Egypt. So you could see that influencing the attitude toward the Horn from there. Ethiopia has, I'm afraid, always been the big kid on the block, so to speak, and has attracted the most attention from the U.S. So the U.S. interest in the area has been about how to have a relationship with a stable, strong Ethiopia, as well as Eritrea, Sudan, Djibouti, and so on. If you pit Eritrea versus Ethiopia, it's going to be a very hard case to make that Eritrea is more important than Ethiopia because of a much larger country with tremendous influence in the continent as well. It's the headquarters for economic activity, for diplomatic activity. Ethiopia has been involved in peacekeeping operations in the surrounding area that meet U.S. interests in other areas. You're not going to see them walk away from that. Now, the instability in Ethiopia today raises some questions about the U.S. policy and how to pursue it. But the idea that humanitarian or human rights concerns would cause the U.S. to shift to support for Eritrea over Ethiopia, I think is naive. The interest U.S. has is having a peace between Eritrea and Ethiopia and a peaceful relationship there that could be the cornerstone of an alliance that would strengthen the whole region. I mean, there are a lot of arguments for the U.S. having a stronger relationship with Eritrea. Eritrea has been a troublemaker in the region for U.S. policy in many respects, but it also has the ability to be a force for stability and peace. The Eritreans have always understood, this includes the Isaias regime, understood the way Somalia works, the way Sudan works. It can be a force, a constructive force in any of those areas if it wants to be. I don't see that happening right now, but it could be. And the idea of having the relationship between Eritrea and Ethiopia be the base of U.S. interest in the region has long been the goal for the U.S. That has not been possible in part because of the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia and because of the relationship between the U.S. and Isaias Afwerki. He has been a very difficult person to work with. Oh, repeatedly. You know, the U.S. and Eritrea do not have embassies. They don't have ambassadors in each other's countries. We have a chief of mission, they have a chief of mission. And it's been that way for like...
I don't know if there's like any long-term friend that has been with Isaias. And I think in our early discussion, you talked about, you know, who's been his allies, long-term friends, and just kind of like talk about a little bit on that. And then we'll go to the second part of this question, which is basically what could the diaspora do, and then any transitional government.
Sure. If you go back to the 1970s and the EPRP, the party, had a political manual that it used for its political education within the EPLF. In that, it laid out who are Eritrea's strategic friends and its allies and who aren't. There was a very rigid ideological take on that. And it was built around the classic socialist analysis of the working class, the Soviet Union, the socialist countries, and so on. The Soviet intervention in 1977-78 blew that up, basically. And it made everybody rethink. And I think Isaias particularly came out of that into a kind of radical nationalist politics that said Eritrea first, make Eritrea great again, maybe. But it was Eritrea first. And he came out of that, I think, convinced that there aren't any strategic allies for Eritrea. There's nobody you can trust. I mean, and I understand where that comes from, because the US had stabbed it in the back several times. The Soviet Union stabbed it in the back in 1977, having been a big backer, and all of a sudden, no. Now that Ethiopia is socialist and our ally, you have to put away your demand for independence and come with us. The African National Congress in South Africa, which had been a steadfast supporter of Eritrea, all of a sudden did the same thing, following in the path of its relationship with the Soviet Union. Yemen, which had been an ally of Eritrea, turned around and sent tanks and fighters to fight on Ethiopia's side against the struggle. I mean, you know, there were a lot of bad lessons there. So Isaias came out of it convinced that there was nobody he could trust, which left him also thinking that I can work with anybody as long as it's in my interest and in my perception of Eritrea's interest at the time. So if that isn't too crazy, it means if you can't trust anybody, you don't have to trust them, but you can work with any. There's nobody you can't work with because they're all basically alike. So that meant that Eritrea has at various times been drawn to Israel, to Iran, to Libya, to the now lately the Saudis and the Emiratis. But none of those relationships are stable, and everybody who works with Eritrea knows that. So the Saudis know that very well. The Emiratis know that. They make the decision that they're working with Eritrea because it suits them at the time. And the Egyptians the same. So the whole region is now being driven by short-term interest, which is a very dangerous situation to be in.
And in that space, could you see a diaspora based like a transitional government or strong like influencers to make a better change inside Eritrea?
Well, this is a perennial question. I do not see the prospect of an outside government, a government in waiting. That has to have a base of active support inside a country to work. So for example, the African National Congress built this very strong organization outside the country. It also had a very strong organization inside South Africa with the trade union movement, women's movements, and so on. Where is that in Eritrea? So the idea of creating an alternative that would just come back in and implant itself, it's almost like colonizing Eritrea from the outside. I hate to say it. And it's not going to work. However, Eritrea is a transnational country. Its population is out as much as it is in. And it's very actively engaged. So the population has to be involved in Eritrea's future. And the fact that it's only involved now through paying diaspora taxes and kowtowing to the leadership is a tremendous weakness of the state itself. I see the diaspora as being critical to Eritrea's future, but as a partner with people inside. Now, the inside question is the big difficult one here because you can't see any organization there except when Yaakov posters go up in Asmara. It's not like South Africa where you have a trade union movement or lawyer movement or a professional movement like you had in Sudan when they did the uprising there. But I do think that Eritrea's future will be resolved through some partnership between internal forces and external forces. And the outside people can do what maybe you can't do on the inside, and that is to prepare for that by getting engaged with social activities like what's going on now with the support for the refugees in Sudan. It can be involved in organizing itself professionally to provide resources for Eritrea afterward. It can come up with ideas about how Eritrea might look like as a democratic country. And we have to stop for a second and talk about what democracy is. But, and put those ideas out there so that people inside can talk about them, think about them, even if in private, because now you can't have public discussions. But the generation of ideas is part of a transformational process. So that's really important. But if the outside forces are going to have any influence inside, there has to be a greater level of unity than there is now, for one. And there's no way that an outside power like the US, Britain, the EU, or anybody else is going to support a government in waiting if it doesn't have anything to show for itself as a tie-in to the situation inside. It's just not realistic. They're going to deal with what is, and the US is going to do that. The EU is going to do that. You may want to influence how they do that, whether it's through a combination of aid and pressure or carrot and stick. But you're not going to get any big government involved in the area to walk away from Eritrea altogether. They can't afford to. So you have to find some way to have influence without trying to create an alternative that would be the choice between working with Asmara or you.
Yep. No, I think, you know what, Dan, there is something important that you mentioned, which is really making a big influence from social and economical and kind of allowing the people inside the country to have a confidence in the diaspora that they will be able to extend the help that they need post-Isaias.
Yeah, exactly. What can you do for them? And
exactly.
People, yeah, that's
and then I think that's something that the Yaakov, it's a movement, you know, and many people really are having a deep conversation and creating organization on a professional level, and not just only from the aid aspect of it, but, you know, the healthcare organizations, the Law Society of Eritrea, journalists, artists, many of them are now realizing what we have to make a meaningful contribution for the people inside the country, and not just like hold a sign that says down, down Isaias, right? So I think that's a really, really key point. The other part that I want you to discuss, and, you know, I promise we're coming to the end of our conversation, is what do you see post Isaias? So let's say we wake up tomorrow, the man has fled, died, whatever the conversation is. Do you see like a military coup d'etat, or do you see a popular uprising to just kind of make a change, or do you really see this a transition of a dynasty dictatorship where it goes to a family member or a close relationship to Isaias?
I don't think that it's going to go to a family member. Start there and work backwards. I don't think Eritrea is North Korea, and where you can have this kind of socialist monarchy that passes from generation to generation. I could be wrong, of course, but that would really surprise me. It's very hard to tell after that. There are a lot of possibilities. The only organized institution in the country, really, at this point, is the military. So the chances are good that the military will have a key role in whatever comes next. There is also the possibility of a transition that could involve some kind of transitional council that would be drawn from the forces that already exist in Eritrea. That would be, unfortunately, PFDJ, the military, the national security forces, and others. I think from their standpoint, if they wanted to manage a transition that kept the control, they would have to do something like that. There's no one individual, I think, that could step in and be the next Isaias. There would be a balance of contending power centers within Eritrea, perhaps, and it would be held together by a council of that sort with a neutral party running it. The best case scenario would be that these people would see that Eritrea was in basically a cul-de-sac, had dug a hole for itself, and it needed to get out of it with the diaspora. And the diaspora would be invited to come in and participate in that. I do not think that you want to take an approach that says from the outside, we have to do away with everything we don't like. The PFDJ, everybody who's been involved in it has to go. That is the example that happened in Iraq recently, in the 2000s, with the de-Baathification of the country, and the result was ISIS and the fragmentation of the country into civil war. That would be a disaster because the country has been deinstitutionalized. That's a tremendous weakness. That's been part of Isaias's ability to stay in control, but he has also left the country really crippled from the standpoint of state building. You have a parliament that hasn't met since 2002, a government where the foreign minister goes to have meetings with people and he's shadowed by Yamani Gabrab, who's also the foreign minister in waiting or in disguise. You have this institutional facade with a power center just below the surface that is managing most things. What do where is that going to go for the next generation? It has to be rebuilt in many ways. This is where the diaspora can play a critical role in creating, as you were describing, the institutions, the civil society institutions that become the building blocks for going forward. Those have to be mirrored by that kind of work inside as well. But I think the transition for Eritrea after this is going to be a long one. The best case I would see would be a transitional period of about probably 4 years, during which time several things would have to happen. The Constitution would have to be revisited and revised and readopted. There would have to be a structure that would allow for the identification of peace and reconciliation process, similar to what went on in South Africa. Some kind of truth and reconciliation that would involve the acknowledgement of responsibility for terrible things and the acceptance of that on the part of the population so you could move forward. Some people probably disqualified from participating, but only some. But I can't answer that. I think that democracy, just to get back to that, is a contested notion. And it's been contested in the wider world as well as within Eritrean culture for decades. There are the traditional socialist definition was built around economic and social equality. The traditional Western notion has been around political equality. My own view is one that builds on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which suggests that it's all of those things together. I don't think that you can have a true democracy. In the end, means participation and accountability. And there are many ways to do that. Elections are one, elder councils are another, but accountability, there's no accountability in Eritrea now for the government. So there are new ways to build that could be uniquely Eritrean. I don't think uniquely any particular country is likely. It's not the way the world has ever worked, but I know there's this illusion that everything is different in Eritrea and none of the rules that apply to others apply to them. But learning from the experience of others would be really crucial at this point. I hope that people in the diaspora will pay more attention to processes in Rwanda, South Africa, Sudan, where have other countries dealt with trauma political and social trauma and reinvented themselves. But whatever happens, I hope that it embraces a concept of social, economic, and political equality and openness, because in the end, you can't really have a democracy that's strictly political without having, while you have deep economic and social inequalities. We see that with the US, with racism and with inequality, economic inequality, and the way money drives politics. You see the opposite in situations where there is supposed economic equality and no political equality. Because if you don't have power, if you have economic equality one day, you can lose it the next. So, I mean, I think we need to be creative in thinking, what does democracy mean and how do you get there and what is it like to have? I think we also have to get away from the idea that it's a thing we can define in a way, put it in a box and say, okay, we're democratic or we're not. Democracy, as I've certainly learned, is something that you have to keep fighting for, that it changes, and that it's a struggle that is always renewed.
Yep, awesome. So I know we've come up to our time, and I wanted to mention something really important for our viewers. Where can we learn more about the studies that you've done, books you've written, essays you've contributed? I know there's hundreds of them in there. I've looked at many of your interviews on YouTube, but just kind of quickly tell our viewers, where can they learn more from your work?
Well, I've had a website for many years that is down this week, but it's where I have links to, well, my own autobiography a little bit. It also has links to my books and it has links to articles. It's danconnell.net. It's very simple. Dan Connell, C-O-N-N-E-L-L. While we were on this interview, I saw an email came in from WordPress saying they had reconstituted it. It is not taken down by any evil conspiratorial force out there. It was just the screw up in the technology of my webmaster.
Awesome.
But it will be back up this week, and that is one place to go. My latest book was the Historical Dictionary of Eritrea, which is, as you can see, a fat encyclopedia. It's based on a book that was first done by Tom Killian in the 90s that I revised and published under both of our names in 2010, and then I did another issue last year. It's an encyclopedia of fairly short entries that gives you some way to navigate, and especially for others, non-Eritreans who may want to learn more. It's a very expensive book, unfortunately, so you have to get it in the library. Don't even bother to try to spend your money on it. I am working on a memoir right now that will also tentatively called Eritrean Journeys, Mine and Theirs, which will be somewhat autobiographical and also the story of people I've been meeting over the last 6 years in interviewing refugees about why they left, how they got out, and what their vision of a future Eritrea is. There are other people writing about this situation also who I think are certainly worth taking a look at. I've done like a 70-page bibliography on Eritrea for the back of the dictionary with all the resources I could think of. I think that since you've asked me this, I'm going to go back and try to put together a suggested bibliography and put that up on my website.
Yeah, it would be really awesome. I think a lot of times our understanding of the political sphere of Eritrea is very distorted. You know, either you've grown up in the US like myself and you have like just a really deep opinion about what has gone wrong and, you know, not really understanding what's on the ground, or you've been there and you've grown up with a different ideology. So there's a disparity of understanding from like a neutral perspective, or just learning the basics of that. So I think it's ideal to put a list of essays, reports, books to read to get a context of it from a different corner of our political movement and our government and historic of it.
You know, I also, there are a few Eritreans I have a great respect for, young Eritrean writers, young to me at 76. Awat Wilda Michael?
Yep. I actually have a book of his, not too far from me. No, not this one, but yes, I've gotten a few of his book. He's a professor out in Canada. Yep.
Yeah, in Canada at Queen's College.
Yes.
Michael Wildemariam, Boston University, where I am, is another one. Barakat Haile Selassie has been with us for decades, longer even than I have. And I still take tremendous inspiration from him. And there are others. I think there are many Eritrean writers who are thinking about this. And I think the more that there are Eritrean voices speaking about these things, the stronger it will be. Because, you know, I have been engaged for so long here. I have enormous respect for the people of Eritrea, for the ability to pick yourself up when getting knocked down and to build anew, and also to think in new ways about the future. So, okay.
So you got to give me a short answer on this, and then we'll end that conversation. If you've gotten a chance to go post Isaias and things are just peace and making a transition, would you move to Eritrea? If so, where would you reside?
I would love to be part-time in Eritrea, but I have a life here as well. I am a person split between two countries and two identities, in a sense. Eritrea has become so much a part of my life that I can't think much about the world without thinking about where it is and who it is and where I fit in. I would love to get back. I would love to have a place to live there, but it would be a kind of shuttle back and forth.
And where would you stay?
Well, you know, this is a tough one. I always liked Ginda and Karen because they were in the kind of halfway area between the highlands and the lowlands. But, you know, Asmara, of course, is the center of so much that it would probably end up being closer to that.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thank you so much for really giving us the opportunity to sit down with you. We hope this is not the last one, and promise to give us more of your time. I just want to make a quick announcement at 4 p.m. at the Baito Yaakul. We'll make an announcement on the upcoming demonstration condemning Isaias and Abi's involvement in the country's affair. So hopefully you guys tune in at 4 p.m. and let's thank Dan for really giving us a great opportunity to look at Eritrea through his lenses. Dan, it's a pleasure chatting with you, and thank you for your time.
Thanks. I'm looking forward to more conversations with us, and I'm looking forward to more attention from the administration in Washington on the situation in the Horn and more constructive work to move it forward. Cool. And I will do whatever I can to encourage it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan.
Natina, can I ask one quick question? I'm sorry to bring it at the end. Dan, what do you advise Yaakul to create connections with the study groups in the US? That question came to me when you mentioned Michael Wildemariam of Boston.
Yeah. Well, let me just step back to talk about the US government again, because we kind of left that off. Maybe I was too long-winded earlier. The US government functions on foreign policy through the State Department and through the National Security Council. State Department is a key connection point, but it also functions through the Congress. And, you know, we talked before about the way nations operate. They operate depending on what they perceive their interest to be, and you have to be able to match that. You have to do the same with Congress. The Congress and the government in general are very responsive to constituencies that they perceive to be out there that can support them. voting constituencies are critical to that. So if you can demonstrate a significant base of support that cares about one thing, whatever it is, peace in Eritrea, the end of the state of emergency and the limitations on national service, whatever it is, you can lobby Congress, and you can also lobby the State Department through the demonstration of an active constituency. You have actually got an Eritrean in the Congress, Joe Negussi. You've got others who are having influence on Congress. Identify the members of Congress who you think are open to your concerns and work with them. Work with people in their offices. Often the relationships you build at the office itself are more important than the person who holds the office at the top, because you can engage with them on a more active way. You have a State Department that is being reconstructed after being practically dismantled and deinstitutionalized under the last administration. You have a lot of people in the State Department who are interested in Eritrea, have some knowledge about it. Linda Thomas Greenfield, who will be at the UN, has an intimate knowledge of the Horn of Africa from her work there before as the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs. I know she's met Isaias. She's been in Eritrea. Isaias didn't want to talk to her at the time, but that's typical. But, she is somebody, and she is a cabinet level appointee who is right there in New York. I think having a contact in her office, maybe not with her, but with somebody else in the office to channel your interest in Eritrea's role in the world and your concerns about America's relationship with Eritrea. That's an avenue. We have a new ambassador to Ethiopia, Gita Pasi, who is just preparing to go. She should be over there next week. She is a fresh face and a fresh voice on the Horn in general. You have a guy named Steve Walker, who is in the embassy Stephen Walker, who is the chargé d'affaires, the chief of mission in Asmara, who has been there now for a year. He is also somebody to follow up with in different ways. And there are desk officers who work on Eritrea in the State Department. Those desk officers can be more important to you as an avenue into influencing policy than trying to get to Blinken, the Secretary of State, because you just won't get to him. So my advice is go to the intermediate levels, try to make connections, explain why they should care what you have to say, and then say what you have to say. Now, I'm not sure that's the answer to the question that was asked, but it was a question that I wanted to get back to. Tualdo?
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Thank you. I was also hoping you may add to, for example, the Institute for Peace, the other study groups, because the foreign policy of the US usually is based off of their research and presentations they give to the Congress and other offices. So the reason I remember that question is I saw Mikhail Waldemariam being one of the panelists at the USIP, exactly.
Yeah, no, and he's on a sabbatical now, I think, in Washington for the year. So Michael is a good person into that. The USIP has been important. The Atlantic Council has had some influence, but they've been so wrapped up with the regime and with Isaias that they're really perceived as being fairly limited. The Brookings Institution is another one that is worth looking at and talking to people there. What else? I'm not sure. There is the World Peace Institute up in Boston at Tufts University, Alex DeWall, who is a potential avenue for this. I'll think about that and try to get back.
Yes, yeah. So you will connect us with whoever you have connections with. That was the main view that I wanted to clarify. Thank you.
I think that there are a lot of people who know about Eritrea who have been very frustrated with the inability to work with the country until now, but who would jump in a minute if the opportunity were there in a constructive way. Maybe some in an unconstructive way too. So be careful.
I love your sense of humor, Dan. You definitely have spent a lot of time with Eritreans because the communication is with the humor a little bit. So I appreciate your time again. I know we're well past into the hour, so I want to thank our viewers. There's a lot of people who really in the comment section thanking you and eager to hear more from you. So there's probably a lot of inquiries coming in to hear more from you in particular topics, and we appreciate if you extend us your time in the future as well.
Gizabkum. Dankum.
All right, Paulina may end it.
يأكل نبل كلنا نسلامنا يأكل نبل كلنا نحكن قوامنا يأكل نبل كلنا ونعبيتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا وهدتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا غرعتنا سقرم سقرم سقرم